There was a time when I believed success was measured by promotions, bigger paychecks, and longer hours at the office. I was 29 years old, living in New York City, working as a software engineer for one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. From the outside, my life looked perfect. A modern apartment overlooking the skyline, a new car, friends who envied my career, parents who proudly told relatives, "Ryan is doing very well." But behind every achievement, there was something I kept postponing. Home. For almost 3 years, I hadn't visited the small town where I grew up. Every holiday, I had an excuse. I'm too busy. The project deadline got moved up. I'll come next month. Next month always became another month. My parents stopped asking as often. They already knew the answer. Only one person never stopped calling. My grandfather. Every Sunday afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, like clockwork, the phone would ring. His name would appear on the screen. Grandpa. Sometimes I answered. Most of the time, I pressed decline, then sent the same message. "Sorry, Grandpa. Busy today. I'll call you tonight." Most nights, I forgot. The following Sunday, he would call again, as if nothing had happened. Never angry, never disappointed, just happy to hear my voice, even if it was only for a minute. One rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting in a meeting. Again, his name appeared. Grandpa. Without thinking, I silenced the call. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. I almost ignored it, but something made me press play. His familiar voice filled my headphones. Soft, warm, a little slower than I remembered. "Hi, Ryan. Don't worry if you're busy. I just wanted to ask you something." He paused. I could hear birds singing in the background, probably sitting on his old porch, just like every afternoon. Then he continued, "The fish are biting again at Miller Lake. Remember when you were little? You said we'd catch the biggest fish together someday?" A quiet chuckle. "Well, I'm getting old. Maybe we should stop waiting." Another long pause. Then, the words that would stay with me forever. "You don't have to stay long. Just one weekend. I'd really like to see my grandson." The voicemail ended. I stared at my phone. For a moment, I almost opened my calendar. Almost booked the trip. Almost. Then my manager walked into the room. "Ryan, the Chicago client moved the deadline. We're working all weekend." I looked back at my phone. My thumb hovered over Grandpa's number. Instead, I typed another message. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. After this project, I promise I'll come." I hit send. A minute later, he replied. Only 4 words. "I'll be waiting, son." I smiled, closed my phone, and went back to work. I had no idea those would be the last words my grandfather would ever text me. Because early Saturday morning, while I was sitting in front of 3 computer monitors, my mother called. I answered with a smile. "Hey, Mom." She was crying. "Ryan, your grandfather collapsed." My heart stopped. The room around me suddenly disappeared. "Is he?" "He survived, but the doctors don't know how much time he has." The phone slipped from my hand. On my desk, my laptop was still displaying unfinished code. Emails continued arriving. My manager was asking for updates. None of it mattered anymore. For the first time in years, I realized something terrifying. Work had always been willing to wait for Monday. Family doesn't always get that chance. 45 minutes later, I was driving home, praying that I wasn't already too late. The drive home felt endless. 300 miles, 5 hours. Every red light felt personal. Every traffic jam felt cruel. I kept replaying Grandpa's voicemail. Just one weekend. That was all he wanted. Not money, not gifts, not a long vacation. Just one weekend with his grandson. And I had been too busy. My phone buzzed again. It was Mom. "Where are you?" "About an hour away." She hesitated before speaking. "He's awake." Relief washed over me. "But the doctors said his heart is very weak. They don't know how much longer he'll have." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Tell him I'm coming." "I already did." A small pause. He smiled. That single sentence nearly broke me. When I finally reached the hospital, it was almost sunset. The building looked exactly as I remembered. Plain white walls, automatic glass doors. the smell of disinfectant filling every hallway. I hurried toward room 214. Outside the door, my mother was sitting quietly. Her eyes were red from crying. She stood the moment she saw me. Without saying a word, she hugged me tightly. "You made it." I looked toward the room. "How is he?" She smiled softly. "He keeps asking what time you'll arrive." My throat tightened. He never stopped believing I'd come. Mom gently squeezed my hand. He never did. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. Grandpa was sitting up in bed. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside him. An oxygen tube rested beneath his nose. He looked thinner than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white. His hands, the hands that once built tree houses, fixed bicycles, and taught me how to fish, now looked fragile. But the moment he saw me, his face lit up. "There you are." No anger, no disappointment, just happiness, as though I had only been gone for a few days, instead of 3 years. I walked to his bedside. "I'm sorry." The words escaped before I could stop them. "I'm so sorry." He chuckled softly. "For what?" "For taking so long." He reached out and patted the chair beside him. "Sit down." I did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like coming home after a very long trip. Finally, Grandpa looked at me with the same gentle eyes I'd known my entire life. "You've lost weight." I laughed through my tears. "I think you're supposed to say that I've gotten older." He smiled. I noticed that too. For the first time all day, I laughed. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't shared in years. After a while, I noticed a paper bag on the bedside table. Inside was a small tackle box. Old, scratched, its green paint faded by decades of use. I recognized it immediately. Our fishing gear. Grandpa nodded. "I packed it before I came here." "You did?" I thought, if I got out of the hospital, we could still go. His voice was calm, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I looked at the tackle box, then back at him. "I promise. This weekend, we're going." His smile grew wider. "I knew you'd say yes." I felt my heart sink. He had never doubted me, even after all the broken promises. The doctor entered a few minutes later. He greeted us politely before asking if he could speak with me outside. I followed him into the hallway. He closed the door gently. "Your grandfather is stable, but his heart has become much weaker." I swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means he shouldn't be waiting for someday anymore." The words echoed inside my mind. "Shouldn't be waiting for someday." The doctor continued. "If there's anything the two of you still want to do together, I wouldn't postpone it." I nodded silently. There was nothing else to say. That evening, as I helped Grandpa settle back into bed, he reached into the drawer beside him. He pulled out a folded map. The edges were worn. Small circles had been drawn in red ink. "What is this?" He smiled. "Places I always wanted to take you." There were dozens of circles. The old fishing lake, a hiking trail, the apple orchard where my grandmother and he had their first date, a tiny diner famous for homemade pie, even a hill overlooking the valley where he used to watch the sunrise. I looked at him in disbelief. "You planned all of this?" "One trip at a time." He folded the map carefully. I figured. We had plenty of years. Neither of us spoke, because suddenly, we both understood the same painful truth. We had always believed there would be more time. Sometimes, the greatest mistake we make isn't saying goodbye. It's assuming we'll always have another chance to say hello. As I turned off the hospital room light, Grandpa smiled and whispered one last sentence before falling asleep. "Tomorrow, let's stop talking about the weekend and finally start living it." I had no idea that those 2 days would become the most important weekend of my entire life. The doctors discharged Grandpa the following afternoon. They handed him a list of medications, a strict diet, and one piece of advice: take it easy. Grandpa smiled politely, then whispered to me as we walked toward the parking lot. "I've spent 80 years taking it easy. I think I'd rather spend whatever time I have left living." I laughed. For the first time since arriving home, it didn't feel forced. Instead of driving straight to his house, Grandpa pointed toward an old country road, one small stop. I glanced at him. "We're not going home?" He shook his head. "Not yet." 20 minutes later, we pulled into a tiny roadside diner. The paint on the building was peeling. The sign above the entrance leaned slightly to one side. Nothing had changed since I was a little boy. As soon as we walked inside, an elderly waitress looked up from behind the counter. Her face lit up. "Well, I'll be Henry Thompson." Grandpa tipped his old baseball cap. "Morning, Martha." She looked at me for a few seconds, then gasped, "Is that little Ryan?" I laughed. "I don't think anyone has called me little in 20 years. She smiled. "You used to steal extra pancakes when your grandpa wasn't looking." Grandpa laughed. "I saw every single one. You just pretended not to." He winked. "Exactly." We sat in the same booth we had always used. By the window, Grandpa ordered without even opening the menu, 2 stacks of blueberry pancakes and 2 hot chocolates. I smiled. "You still remember?" He looked surprised. Some things are too important to forget. While we waited for breakfast, I noticed that almost everyone in the diner knew Grandpa. A farmer walked over just to shake his hand. A young mother introduced her little daughter. The owner refused to let Grandpa pay for coffee. On the way back to the table, someone quietly said, "Your grandfather helped us when our barn burned down." Another person added, "He fixed my roof and never accepted a dollar." Then another, "He visited my husband every week when he was in hospice." I looked at Grandpa. "You never told me any of this." He shrugged. "There wasn't much to tell, but you helped so many people." He smiled gently. "When someone needs help, you help. You don't keep score." His answer was so simple, yet somehow, it explained the kind of man he had always been. After breakfast, we finally drove back to his farmhouse. The white wooden fence had faded with time. The porch swing still creaked in the wind. The old maple tree in the front yard had grown even larger. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, except the memories. Those somehow felt bigger. As we stepped onto the porch, Grandpa stopped. He bent down slowly and picked up a smooth, flat stone. "You remember this?" I frowned. Then, suddenly, I did. I had painted it when I was 7 years old. A crooked blue fish. My name written in messy green letters. Ryan. I thought this was gone. Grandpa smiled. "I moved it every spring before mowing the lawn. For 22 years. I stared at the tiny stone. "You kept it?" He laughed softly. "Of course. You made it." At that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten. While I had been chasing promotions, deadlines, and bigger apartments, Grandpa had been quietly protecting the smallest pieces of my childhood, because, to him, they were priceless. That evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset, just like we used to. No phones, no television, no distractions, only the sound of crickets filling the warm summer air. Grandpa finally broke the silence. "Ryan, can I ask you something?" "Anything." He looked toward the orange sky. "When was the last time you watched a sunset without checking your phone?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. I honestly couldn't remember. He smiled kindly. "I didn't ask to make you feel guilty. I asked because life keeps happening while we're looking somewhere else." His words stayed with me long after the sun disappeared behind the hills. Later that night, as I helped him lock the front door, he handed me an old brass key. The key was worn smooth by decades of use. "What is this open?" He smiled. "My workshop. I haven't been inside for almost a year." I looked at the key in my hand. "I thought you wanted to go fishing tomorrow." "We will." He nodded. "But before that, there's something inside that workshop. I've been saving for you since the day you were born." I looked toward the small wooden building behind the house. Its windows were dusty. Its door hadn't been opened in months. Suddenly, the weekend became about more than fishing. Whatever Grandpa had kept inside that workshop, I had a feeling it would change the way I saw him, and perhaps the way I saw my own life forever. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I heard it, the familiar creak of the porch swing. I looked out the window. Grandpa was already outside, a cup of coffee in one hand, watching the morning mist roll across the fields, just as he had done every day for decades. I joined him on the porch. "You should be resting." He smiled. "I've rested enough in the hospital." He handed me another mug. "You know, sunrises taste better with coffee." I laughed. "I don't think that's how coffee works." He shrugged. Maybe not, but it works for me. After breakfast, Grandpa reached into his pocket and placed the old brass key in my hand. Ready? I looked toward the small workshop behind the house. The weathered wooden building stood quietly beneath an old oak tree. Its roof had faded, the paint had peeled, but somehow, it still looked full of life. We walked slowly across the yard. When I unlocked the door, it creaked open with a long, familiar groan. The smell hit me immediately. Fresh cut cedar, old pine, machine oil, sawdust. It smelled exactly like my childhood. The workbench was still there. Every tool hung neatly on the wall. Hand planes, wood chisels, old hammers polished smooth by years of use. Nothing had been moved. It felt as though Grandpa had simply stepped out for lunch. Then I noticed something unusual. Along one wall, dozens of small wooden toys sat on carefully built shelves. Toy cars, rocking horses, birdhouses, tiny sailboats, each one handcrafted, each one different. I looked at Grandpa. "You made all of these?" He nodded. "One every Christmas." I frowned. "But there are so many." He smiled. "I never knew how many grandchildren I'd have, so I kept making them." I ran my fingers across a little wooden train. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every wheel turned perfectly. Every detail had been carved by hand. "Did you ever sell these?" He shook his head. "They were never meant to be sold." "Then who were they for?" He looked at me with a gentle smile. "For family." In the corner of the workshop stood a large cabinet covered with an old blanket. Grandpa slowly walked over. "I've been waiting a long time to show you this." He lifted the blanket. Underneath stood a beautifully crafted wooden chest. Dark walnut, hand-carved vines along the edges, a brass handle polished until it gleamed. I had never seen anything like it. "When did you make this?" He rested his hand on the lid. "The year you were born." I stared at him. "You've had it for 29 years?" He nodded. "I worked on it whenever I had spare time. Sometimes only 10 minutes. Sometimes an hour. It took me almost 8 years to finish." I was speechless. 8 years. For one wooden chest. Grandpa gently opened the lid. Inside, there wasn't money. There weren't family jewels. Instead, there were dozens of carefully wrapped bundles, each labeled with a year. A, it, I, two, A, tre, all the way to A, etten. My heart began to race. "What are these?" He picked up the first bundle. "A memory." He handed it to me. Inside was a tiny blue baby shoe. "I found that under your crib after your first birthday." The next bundle held a baseball card we used to collect together. Another contained a dried maple leaf. "I remember this," I whispered. "We picked it up after school." Grandpa smiled. "You said it looked like fire." Every bundle held something small, something ordinary. A marble, a fishing lure, a school ribbon, a toy soldier missing one arm. To anyone else, they looked like worthless objects. To Grandpa, they were chapters of my childhood. I looked at him, overwhelmed. "You remembered all of this?" He smiled softly. "No, I remembered you." Those 4 words settled deep inside my heart. For years, I had measured success by the things I earned. Grandpa had measured life by the people he loved. There was a difference, a very big difference. As I carefully placed everything back into the chest, I noticed one final compartment hidden beneath the bottom panel. "What goes here?" Grandpa became unusually quiet. His smile faded just a little. "That is for something I never finished." "What do you mean?" He looked out the workshop window toward the old maple tree. "I always believed we'd build it together." I frowned. "Build what?" Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. It was old. The edges had yellowed with time. Across the top, written in his careful handwriting, were 3 simple words: father and son. I looked up, confused. "Grandpa, what is this?" He smiled. "It's the project your father and I never had the chance to finish." I unfolded the paper slowly. It wasn't a letter. It was a blueprint for something neither of them had ever built. And, somehow, I knew the next day would become the most meaningful day of my entire life. I stared at the blueprint. Across the top, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, were the words, father and son. The paper had faded with age. The corners were worn. Tiny pencil marks covered every inch of the drawing. Measurements, notes, little reminders written in the margins. It wasn't just a blueprint. It was a dream. I looked up. "What is it?" Grandpa smiled softly. "It's a treehouse." "A treehouse?" He nodded. "The one your father and I promised we'd build together." I looked back at the drawing. The design was beautiful. 2 levels, a small wooden porch, a rope bridge, even a tiny telescope pointing toward the sky. It looked like something every child would dream of. "So why didn't you build it?" Grandpa's smile slowly disappeared. "Life happened." He sat down on an old wooden stool. For a long moment, he simply stared at the blueprint. "Your father was about your age when he left this town. He wanted to give your family a better life. So he worked, and worked, and worked some more." I lowered my eyes. The story sounded familiar. "Tu familiar," he always said. "Next summer we'll build it." But next summer became the year after. Then another. Eventually, you were already too old for tree houses. The workshop fell silent. How many dreams disappear? Not because people stop caring, but because they believe there's always more time. Grandpa folded the blueprint carefully, then placed it in my hands. "I don't want this dream to end with me." I looked at him. "What are you saying?" He smiled. "I want us to build it." I laughed in disbelief. "Now?" He nodded. "Why not?" "But I'm 29. "I know." He chuckled. "So it'll be a treehouse for grown men." We both laughed. It felt ridiculous, and somehow, it felt perfect. That afternoon, we drove into town to buy lumber. The cashier smiled when she saw Grandpa. "Starting another project?" Grandpa looked at me. "Our most important one." She glanced between us and smiled. "Then take your time." Those words stayed with me. Take your time. Something I hadn't truly done in years. Back at the farmhouse, we carried the wood beneath the giant maple tree. The same tree where Grandpa had hung my first swing. The same tree I used to climb every summer. Grandpa handed me a hammer. "Do you remember the first thing I ever taught you?" I smiled. "You said, measure twice." He laughed. "And? Coot, once." He nodded proudly. "Good. But I forgot the second lesson." "What was it?" He looked at me with gentle eyes. "Never rush something you're building with love." The words hit me harder than he probably realized. He wasn't talking about wood. He was talking about life, about families, about relationships, about the moments we hurry through, only to wish we could have back later. For hours, we worked side by side, sawing, measuring, hammering, talking. Sometimes we shared stories. Sometimes we worked in complete silence. Neither felt uncomfortable. The sound of birds, the breeze through the leaves, the rhythm of our hammers, it all felt strangely peaceful. Then, Grandpa suddenly stopped. He leaned against the tree, breathing heavily. I rushed over. "Grandpa, I'm okay." But he wasn't. His face had turned pale. Sweat covered his forehead. I helped him sit down on an old wooden bench. "You need to rest." He smiled weakly. "I told you, I'm not as strong as I used to be." I handed him a bottle of water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked up into the branches above us. "You know, I don't care if we finish the treehouse." I frowned. "What?" "I only cared that I got to build part of it with you." A lump formed in my throat. It wasn't the project that mattered. It never had been. It was the time, the conversations, the laughter, the memories created between each piece of wood. At that moment, I understood something I should have learned years ago. People rarely remember what you built. They remember who built it beside them. As the sun began to set, Grandpa reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out an old black and white photograph. It showed a much younger version of him, standing beside my father, both smiling, both holding the exact same blueprint we had just used. On the back of the photo, someone had written a single sentence. "Some dreams are meant to wait for the right generation." I looked at Grandpa. He smiled quietly. "I think your father would be proud that we finally started." I didn't know it then, but the next morning, my father would unexpectedly arrive at the farmhouse, and 3 generations of our family would finally finish the dream that had waited almost 30 years. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway. At first, I thought it was one of Grandpa's neighbors, but when I looked through the window, my heart skipped a beat. It was my father. He climbed out of his old pickup truck holding a paper bag in one hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. It had been months since we'd seen each other. Our relationship had never been bad, but somewhere along the way, it had become distant, just like mine had with Grandpa. Dad smiled awkwardly. "Your mom called. She said your grandpa was home." I nodded. "He'll be happy you're here." Before I could say anything else, the front door opened. Grandpa stepped onto the porch. For a second, he simply stared at his son. Then, a wide smile spread across his face. "Well, look who finally decided to come home." Dad laughed. I figured I was overdue. The two men hugged. Not for long, not dramatically, just long enough for decades of love to speak without words. Watching them, I realized something. Sometimes fathers and sons don't struggle because they don't love each other. They struggle because neither one knows how to say it. After breakfast, Grandpa carried the old blueprint outside. He carefully unfolded it across the workbench. Dad froze the moment he saw it. "You still have this?" Grandpa smiled. "I've kept it all these years." Dad gently touched the faded paper. "I thought you threw it away." "I almost did," Grandpa admitted, "but something told me to wait." Dad looked down. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For never coming back to finish it." Grandpa placed a hand on his shoulder. "You came back today. That's enough for me." Those simple words carried years of forgiveness. No blame, no lectures, just another chance. The three of us walked toward the maple tree. The unfinished frame from yesterday stood quietly beneath its branches. Dad looked around and smiled. "You actually started." Grandpa laughed. "He swings a hammer better than he types." I rolled my eyes. "I'll take that as a compliment." For the next several hours, 3 generations worked side by side. Grandpa measured. Dad cut the lumber. I drove in the nails. Every so often, Grandpa would stop us. "Measure again." Dad laughed. "You're still a perfectionist." Grandpa smiled. "No, I've just learned that fixing mistakes takes longer than preventing them." I couldn't help thinking, maybe that lesson wasn't about carpentry either. Around lunchtime, we sat beneath the tree eating sandwiches Mom had packed. The conversation drifted from one memory to another. Dad pointed toward the old barn. "Remember when Ryan tried to ride the goat?" Grandpa burst into laughter. "He made it 3 whole seconds." "I made it 4. I protested. 3. They both answered together. We laughed until our stomachs hurt. It was the kind of laughter that only families understand, the kind built over decades of shared memories. Later that afternoon, Dad quietly walked over to me while Grandpa rested in the shade. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. I looked at him. "I almost didn't." He nodded. "I know. I almost didn't either." We stood there in silence. Then Dad looked toward Grandpa. "You know, when I was your age, I thought success meant giving my family everything." He paused. "I didn't realize the most valuable thing I could give them was my time." His words reminded me of my own life in New York. The endless meetings, late nights, missed birthdays, ignored phone calls. Suddenly, I saw myself becoming the same man he had once been, not because he was selfish, because he believed sacrifice only meant working harder. As the sun began to set, the final wooden plank was secured. The treehouse wasn't enormous, it wasn't luxurious, but it was beautiful, because every board, every nail, every beam had been placed there by someone who loved the others. Grandpa slowly climbed the small wooden steps. Dad and I followed behind him. The 3 of us sat quietly on the little porch overlooking the fields. A warm breeze moved through the trees. For a while, nobody spoke. Then Grandpa smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" Dad asked. "I always thought I was building a treehouse." He looked at both of us, but I was really rebuilding my family. No one answered, because there was nothing left to add. As the evening sky turned golden, Grandpa reached into his jacket pocket. He removed a small envelope. Across the front, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Open after I'm gone." He handed it to my father. "Promise me, you won't read it until the right time." Dad looked confused. "But why?" Grandpa simply smiled. "Because some lessons take a lifetime to understand." I had no idea then. that the letter inside that envelope would become the final gift my grandfather would ever leave our family. The weekend passed faster than any weekend I could remember. On Sunday afternoon, Dad drove Grandpa back to the house after one last walk around the farm. The treehouse stood proudly beneath the old maple tree. Simple, strong, beautiful. Grandpa looked up at it and smiled. "You boys did a good job." Dad laughed. "No, we did." Grandpa nodded. Exactly. That evening, the three of us sat on the porch. No television, no phones, just 3 generations watching the sunset disappear behind the hills. Grandpa broke the silence. "You know what I love most about getting old?" Dad smiled. "What?" "You stop pretending." I looked at him. He chuckled. "When you're young, you spend your life trying to impress strangers. When you're old, you realize the only opinions that ever mattered were sitting at your own dinner table." None of us spoke, because every word was true. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee. Grandpa was already in the kitchen, still wearing his favorite blue flannel shirt. He hummed softly while flipping pancakes, exactly the way he used to when I was a little boy. "You should be resting," I said. He smiled. "I rest when I sit. I cook when I'm happy." We shared breakfast together. It felt so ordinary, and somehow, that made it perfect. Before Dad and I left for the city, Grandpa hugged each of us. He held on a little longer than usual, almost as if he knew. "Don't wait so long next time," he whispered. "I won't," I answered. This time, I meant it. 3 weeks later, my phone rang just after sunrise. It was Dad. His voice was unusually quiet. "Ryan, you should come home." I already knew. Somehow, I already knew. When? Last night. He went peacefully. He fell asleep in his chair, looking toward the treehouse. The world around me became silent. I didn't cry immediately. I simply sat there, holding the phone, staring at Grandpa's last text message. "Drive safely next time." That was who he was. Even his final message was worrying about someone else. The funeral brought together nearly the entire town. People I had never met stood in line for hours. A retired teacher, a firefighter, a mail carrier, farmers, neighbors, children who were now adults. They shared stories. He fixed my roof after the storm. He paid my college application fee. He taught me how to fish. He visited my wife every week after my surgery. He never let anyone feel alone. I looked at Dad. Neither of us knew half of these stories. Grandpa had spent his life helping people, without ever talking about it. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Dad and I sat inside the workshop. Neither of us felt ready to leave. Then Dad reached into his jacket pocket. The envelope, the one Grandpa had given him beneath the maple tree. Across the front were the words, "Open after I'm gone." Dad turned it over slowly. His hands trembled. "I guess this is the right time." He carefully broke the seal. Inside, there was only one folded sheet of paper. No will, no instructions, just Grandpa's handwriting. Dad looked at me. "I think we should read it together." I nodded. He unfolded the letter. His voice shook as he began. "My dear son, if you're reading this, then I've finally gone where your mother has been waiting for me. Don't be sad for too long. I've had a wonderful life, longer than I ever expected, better than I ever deserved. There's only one thing I hope you understand. Please stop apologizing for the years you couldn't give me. A father never counts the days his child was absent. He treasures the days they came home. Every visit, every phone call, every hug was enough. You were enough. You always were." Dad stopped reading. His voice broke. Tears rolled freely down his face. For years, he had carried guilt he never spoke about. And somehow, Grandpa knew. He always knew. I gently placed my hand on Dad's shoulder. "Keep reading." He nodded, but neither of us was prepared for the final page, because Grandpa had written something, not only for his son, but for me as well. And those final words would change the course of my life forever. The workshop was silent. Only the ticking of Grandpa's old wall clock filled the room. Dad wiped his eyes. He looked at the second page of the letter. "I don't know if I can read this." I gently nodded. "You can." He took a deep breath, then continued. "Ryan, if your father is reading this aloud, Then you're standing beside him. That makes an old man very happy. There are a few things I want you to know. First, don't be angry at your father for working so much. I watched him carry burdens he never spoke about. He wasn't chasing money. He was chasing security for his family. Sometimes, good men make the mistake of believing love is measured by how much they provide. It isn't, but they don't learn that until much later. So forgive him, not because he was perfect, because he always loved you. I looked toward my father. He couldn't lift his eyes from the paper. For years, he had quietly blamed himself. Now, even after his passing, Grandpa was still trying to heal his son's heart. Dad whispered, "He always protected me." I smiled sadly. "He still is." Dad continued reading. "Ryan, one day, you'll probably become a husband, maybe even a father. When that day comes, please remember something your grandfather learned far too late. Children won't remember the expensive toys. They won't remember the overtime you worked. They won't remember the promotions. They'll remember whether you sat beside them when they were scared, whether you listened when they had something silly to say, whether you looked up from your phone when they walked into the room. Those little moments become the biggest memories. Never trade them away." I felt my throat tighten. Every sentence felt as though it had been written directly for me. I thought about the life waiting back in New York, the endless meetings, the missed birthdays, the weekends sacrificed for work. For the first time, I wasn't proud of how busy I had been. I was ashamed of everything I had missed. Dad unfolded the final page. A small photograph slipped onto the table. It showed me, no older than 6, sitting on Grandpa's shoulders during the county fair. Both of us were laughing, neither of us looking at the camera. On the back, Grandpa had written, "The happiest moments are the ones nobody plans." Dad smiled through tears. "I remember taking this picture." "You do?" He nodded. "You two spent an hour trying to win that giant teddy bear." I laughed. "We never won." "No." Dad smiled, but neither of you cared. For a moment, the sadness disappeared. Only gratitude remained. Dad looked back at the final paragraph. His voice grew steadier. "There's one last favor I'd like to ask. Every year, on the first Saturday of summer, come back to this farm. Bring your children someday. Bring your friends. Bring anyone who feels lonely. Cook together. Fish together. Laugh together. Tell stories about the people who came before you. Because families aren't remembered by the houses they leave behind. They're remembered by the traditions they keep alive. If you do that, then a part of me will always be sitting at the table with you. Love, Grandpa." Neither of us spoke. The letter rested quietly between us. It didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like an invitation to live differently. Dad carefully folded the pages and placed them back inside the envelope. "I think we should honor his wish." I nodded. "Every year, no matter what." He smiled. "No excuse." For the first time in a long while, those words didn't sound like a promise we would break. They sounded like a promise we would keep. As we stood to leave the workshop, I noticed Grandpa's old toolbox sitting beneath the workbench. Inside, among the hammers and chisels, was a small leather notebook tied with a faded piece of string. Dad picked it up carefully. "What is this?" I opened the first page. Across the top, in Grandpa's handwriting, were the words, "Things I want my family to remember." I turned the page. There were hundreds of handwritten entries, one for nearly every year of his life. Stories, lessons, mistakes, dreams. And at that moment, I realized Grandpa had left us something far more valuable than an inheritance. He had left us his entire life's wisdom. I had no idea that the final page of that notebook would completely change the direction of my future. The drive back to New York felt different. The highway was the same. The traffic was the same. The skyline waiting in the distance was the same. But I wasn't. Grandpa's notebook rested on the passenger seat beside me. I must have glanced at it 100 times during the trip. Every time, I heard his voice again. "Never trade your family for a future they may never get to share with you." Those words refused to leave my mind. Monday morning, I walked back into the office. Nothing had changed. Emails flooded my inbox. Meetings filled my calendar. My manager greeted me with a smile. "Glad you're back. We've got another big project." A month earlier, those words would have excited me. Now, they sounded strangely empty. As I sat at my desk, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. Everyone looked exhausted. Coffee cups, dark circles under tired eyes, people talking about promotions while quietly missing birthdays, anniversaries, school plays, and family dinners. It felt like watching my own life from the outside. I opened my desk drawer. Inside was a small framed photograph, Grandpa and I, standing beside the unfinished treehouse years ago. I smiled, then quietly closed my laptop. That evening, I knocked on my manager's office door. He looked surprised. "Everything okay?" I nodded. "I'd like to make a change." "What kind of change?" "I don't want another promotion." He stared at me. "What?" "I want fewer hours." He leaned back in his chair. "Ryan, most people your age are asking for more responsibility." I smiled. I used to be one of those people, but I realized I'm running out of time with the people who matter most. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he smiled. "You know, I missed my daughter's graduation last year. I still regret it." He looked out the window. "Maybe you're making the smarter choice." A few months later, I moved out of the city, not because I stopped loving my career, but because I finally understood a successful life isn't built only by what you accomplish. It's built by who gets to celebrate those accomplishments with you. I found a smaller home, just 30 minutes from my parents. Every Sunday, we had dinner together. No excuse. Dad never missed one. Sometimes we'd laugh about old family stories. Sometimes we'd argue over football. Sometimes we'd simply sit on the porch, watching the sunset, just like Grandpa taught us. The first Saturday of every summer, we returned to the farmhouse, exactly as Grandpa had asked. The treehouse became our tradition. Every year, someone added something new. One year, Dad built a wooden bench. The next, I carved Grandpa's favorite quote into the railing. "Love is spelled T-I-M-E." When my daughter turned 6, she painted a tiny blue fish on one of the wooden posts. Crooked, messu, perfect. I smiled the moment I saw it. It reminded me of the little stone Grandpa had protected for 22 years. Some traditions don't need to be planned. They simply continue. Years passed. The farmhouse became a place where birthdays were celebrated. Christmas mornings were shared. Friends who had nowhere else to go were always welcomed. Just as Grandpa had wanted, one summer evening, my daughter climbed onto my lap inside the treehouse. "Daddy?" "Yes?" "Did great-grandpa really build this?" I smiled. "Not by himself." "Then who helped him?" I looked across the yard. Dad was teaching my son how to cast a fishing line, exactly the way Grandpa had once taught me. I felt tears forming in my eyes. 3 generations built it. And now, it's your turn to keep it alive. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. "I will." That night, after everyone had gone home, I climbed into the treehouse one last time. The stars filled the summer sky. The fields were quiet. The old maple tree gently swayed in the wind. I opened Grandpa's notebook to its very last page. There was one sentence I had never noticed before, written in shaky handwriting, almost as if he had added it near the end of his life. "If my family is together when they read this, then I have already lived a successful life." I closed the notebook, looked out across the farm, and smiled. Grandpa had been right. Success was never about money, never about titles, never about how busy we were. It was measured in shared meals, weekend fishing trips, long conversations on the porch, children laughing beneath an old maple tree, and in the simple decision to show up for the people we love. As I climbed down from the treehouse, I looked back one final time. The porch light glowed warmly. My family was inside, laughing, waiting for me, just as Grandpa always had. This time, I didn't make them wait. I opened the door, stepped inside, and finally understood the greatest inheritance anyone could ever receive. Not wealth, not property, not success, but a family that never stops choosing one another.